The dust of the Mojave Desert settled on everything at Blackwood Air Force Base, a fine, gritty powder that got into your teeth and under your collar. For Anya Sharma, it was just another layer of discomfort to endure. At 24, she was older than most of the new recruits, and she looked more like a librarian than a future fighter pilot. She was slight of build, with quiet, observant eyes that seemed to see right through the bluster and bravado of the young men around her. Were all swagger and muscle, fresh out of college, their faces still soft with the remnants of boyhood. They looked at Anya's slender frame and the thick book she read during downtime, a worn copy of War and Peace, and they dismissed her. Look at Grandma Moses over there. Cadet Miller, a cocky kid from Texas with a trust fund and a sneer, would say to his buddies, just loud enough for Anya to hear. Think she needs a walker to get to the flight simulator? His friends would snort with laughter. The instructor, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Stone, did little to discourage it. He was a man carved from granite and cynicism, a firm believer that the cockpit of a modern fighter jet was no place for a woman, especially not one who looked like she'd be more comfortable in a garden. He'd watch her with narrowed eyes, his jaw tight, as if her very presence was a personal insult. Anya never rose to the bait. She'd just turn a page in her book, her expression unreadable. Inside, however, a quiet fire burned. She had promised herself she wouldn't let them get to her. She was here for a reason, a purpose that ran deeper than their shallow taunts. It was a promise she had made to her father, a man they would never know, a man whose shadow she was determined to honor. The training was brutal, designed to weed out the weak. Grueling physical drills under the scorching desert sun were followed by complex classroom sessions that fried the brain. Then came the simulators, the closest any of them had gotten to a real F-22 Raptor. It was here that the boys' club mentality was at its most suffocating. They would hoot and holler, boasting about their kill ratios in the simulated dogfights, slapping each other on the back. Anya's performance in the simulator was, to everyone's surprise, average. Not terrible, but not great either. She completed the objectives, followed the flight plans, but she never did anything flashy. She never showed the aggressive killer instinct that Stone and the other instructors looked for. She flew with a strange, almost serene precision that they mistook for hesitation. Sharma, you fly like you're parallel parking a minivan. Stone barked at her after one session, his voice crackling over the intercom. The enemy isn't going to wait for you to signal before you make a move. You're too timid. You don't have the heart for it. Anya's hands tightened on the simulator's joystick, her knuckles white. She took a slow, deep breath, the scent of stale air and sweat filling her lungs. Yes, Sergeant, she said, her voice calm, betraying none of the storm raging inside her. That night, as the other recruits were in the mess hall, laughing and joking, Anya slipped away. She made her way to a forgotten corner of the base, a dusty, abandoned hangar that was scheduled for demolition. Inside, shrouded in a heavy canvas tarp, was her secret. It was an old, decommissioned simulator, a relic from a bygone era. It wasn't connected to the base's network. Its software was ancient, but it was all she needed. Her father had taught her to fly in a machine just like this one. He had been a pilot, a legend in a war that was now just a collection of faded photographs and redacted files. He had taught her things that weren't in the official flight manuals, maneuvers that defied the neat, predictable patterns of modern aerial combat. He had taught her to feel the plane, to listen to the whisper of the wind over the wings, to think not like a pilot, but like the aircraft itself. She fired up the old simulator, the hum of the machine a familiar comfort in the vast, empty hangar. The screen flickered to life, displaying a simple, blocky landscape. It was a far cry from the high-definition graphics of the new simulators, but it didn't matter. In her mind, she was back in the cockpit of her father's plane, the roar of the engines in her ears, his voice a steady presence beside her. Don't fight the plane, Anya, he would say. Dance with it. And so, she danced. For hours, she flew in the old simulator, her movements fluid and intuitive. She practiced the maneuvers her father had taught her, the ones that had made him a ghost in the sky, an ace who had racked up an impossible number of victories. The Cobra maneuver, a stall that allowed a plane to seemingly stop in midair. The Herbst maneuver, a high-angle attack turn that could shake any pursuer. These were moves that the new simulators, with their rigid physics engines, would have registered as errors, as pilot-induced stalls. But in the old machine, they were possible. They were art. The next day, during a particularly challenging simulation, the recruits were tasked with a complex dogfighting scenario. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and the enemy AI was programmed to be relentless. One by one, the cocky, young cadets were picked off, their screens flashing with the humiliating red text eject. Eject. Miller, the loudest of the mockers, was the first to go down. They're coming out of nowhere, he yelled in frustration. Soon, only Anya was left, for enemy fighters were closing in on her, their virtual missiles locked on her position. While Sharma, looks like it's your turn to wash out. Stone's voice crackled over the comms, a note of grim satisfaction in his tone. Anya didn't respond. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the tactical display. She could hear her father's voice in her head, calm and steady. When you're cornered, don't run. Redefine the corner. She pulled back on the joystick, cutting the throttle. The nose of her virtual EFT-1E2 pitched up, climbing at an impossible angle. The G-forces would have been crushing in a real aircraft. The alarms in the cockpit blared. "What is she doing?" one of the other recruits murmured, watching on the monitor. "She's stalling," Miller scoffed. "She's panicking." But Anya wasn't panicking. As her plane reached the apex of its climb, seemingly hanging motionless in the air, she performed a maneuver that wasn't in any textbook. A maneuver that shouldn't have been possible. The 4 enemy fighters, caught by surprise, overshot her position. Flying directly underneath her, for a split second, Anya's plane was perfectly positioned above them, like a hawk hovering over its prey. Her fingers danced over the controls, her movements a blur of practiced precision. She fired 4 virtual missiles in rapid succession. The screen in the control room lit up with 4 explosions. 4 enemy fighters. Gone. The simulation ended. Silence. The other recruits stared at the monitor, their mouths agape. Miller's sneer had vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Sergeant Stone leaned forward, his eyes wide. He replayed the last few seconds of the simulation, watching Anya's impossible maneuver again and again. It was a move he had only ever seen once before, a long time ago. A move that had been whispered about in hushed tones by old pilots, a legend from a forgotten war. A move that had been given a name that sent a shiver down his spine. "The Ghost's Gambit," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He looked at Anya, who was now climbing out of the simulator, her face calm, her expression unreadable. But he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, a flicker of something ancient, something dangerous, something that didn't belong in the eyes of a quiet, bookish girl. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Anya Sharma was not who she seemed, and he was beginning to suspect that her average performance up until now had, but in a deliberate act. The question was, why? What was she hiding, and who was the ghost that had taught her to fly like that? The silence in the room was deafening, thick with unspoken questions. Stone had a feeling that the answers would change everything he thought he knew about the young woman they had all so foolishly underestimated. He had to know more. But as he opened his mouth to demand an explanation, a high-ranking officer he'd never seen before, flanked by 2 imposing military police, strode into the room. The officer's eyes, cold and hard, scanned the stunned faces of the cadets before landing on Anya. He didn't speak to Stone, didn't even acknowledge his presence. He walked directly to Anya, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. "Anya Sharma," the officer said, his voice low and urgent, "you need to come with us, now." He didn't wait for a reply, simply turned and walked away, expecting her to follow. The air crackled with tension. The other recruits looked from the officer to Anya, their minds reeling. Who was this girl? And why were the top brass pulling her out of training? Anya's calm expression finally broke. A flicker of something fear, recognition. In her eyes, she glanced at Stone, a silent message passing between them, before turning to follow the officer, leaving a room full of unanswered questions and the chilling echo of a ghost's gambit. The sterile, windowless room felt more like an interrogation cell than an office. The air was cold, recycled, and smelled faintly of bleach. The officer, a man with a chest full of ribbons and a face that looked like it had been carved from ice, introduced himself as Colonel Vance. He sat opposite Anya at a small metal table, his hands folded, his gaze unwavering. The 2 MPs stood at the door, their arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. "Sergeant Stone tells me you performed a rather unconventional maneuver in the simulator today, Cadet Sharma," Vance began, his voice smooth as polished steel. Anya's heart was pounding, a frantic drum against her ribs, but she kept her composure. She had known this day might come, but she hadn't expected it so soon. She had hoped to remain in the shadows, to complete her training without drawing this kind of attention. "I was simply trying to survive the simulation, sir," she replied, her voice steady. Vance leaned forward, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in his cold eyes. "Survive, cadet? What you did was not in any of our training manuals. It's a maneuver that most pilots would consider a death wish. A maneuver that has a name, the Ghost's Gambit, a name that hasn't been spoken on this base in over 20 years. Anya remained silent, her hands resting in her lap. She wouldn't give them anything. Not yet. The Ghost, Vance continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, was a legend. An ace from a conflict that, officially, never happened. A pilot who could make his plane do things that defied the laws of physics. A man who disappeared without a trace, taking his secrets with him. His real name was Captain Marcus Thorne. Anya's breath caught in her throat. She had known her father as Michael Sharma, a quiet, unassuming man who had taught her to fly in an old crop duster and told her stories of the stars. He had never spoken of war, never hinted at the life he had left behind. It was only after his death, when she had found his hidden journals and a single faded photograph of him in a flight suit, that she had begun to piece together the truth. "I'm not familiar with that name, sir," she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. Vance smiled, a thin, humorless curve of his lips. "No, that's interesting because you have his eyes. And, it would seem, his talent. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. We've been looking for him, or someone like him, for a long time, Sharma. The world has gotten more dangerous. We need an edge. We need the ghost. The implication was clear. They didn't just want to know about her father, they wanted to use her. They wanted to turn her into a weapon, just as they had turned him into one. Just a cadet, sir, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm not a legend. Not yet, Vance said, his eyes gleaming. But you have the potential, and we're going to unlock it. The training that followed was unlike anything the other recruits experienced. Anya was separated from her peers, her days now a relentless cycle of intense, one-on-one sessions with a new set of instructors, specialists handpicked by Vance. They pushed her to her limits, physically and mentally. They put her in the most advanced simulators, creating scenarios that were designed to break her. They wanted to see how far she could go, how much of her father's legendary skill she had inherited. The other cadets watched from a distance, their mockery now replaced by a mixture of awe and suspicion. They saw her being escorted to private training areas, saw the grim-faced specialists who never spoke to anyone else. The rumors began to fly. She was a spy. She was part of a secret program. She was something more. Miller, in particular, couldn't let it go. His pride had been wounded, his arrogance shattered by what he had seen in the simulator. He started digging, asking questions, trying to find out who Anya Sharma really was. He spent hours in the base library, poring over old records, searching for any mention of the ghost or Captain Marcus Thorne. Anya, meanwhile, was trapped in her new reality. She flew the simulators until her body ached and her mind was numb. She practiced the maneuvers her father had taught her, honing them to a razor's edge. But she held something back. She never gave them everything. She knew that her father's greatest secret wasn't his skill, but his heart. He had been a warrior, yes, but he had also been a man who understood the cost of war, a man who had walked away from it all to raise his daughter in peace. One evening, exhausted and bruised, she was in the abandoned hangar, seeking solace in the old simulator. She needed to feel close to her father, to hear his voice and the hum of the machine. As she was about to start the simulation, she heard a noise. She froze, her hand hovering over the controls. Miller stepped out of the shadows, his face a mixture of triumph and uncertainty. He was holding a dusty, leather-bound journal. Anya's blood ran cold. It was her father's journal, the one she had hidden in a loose panel in the wall of the hangar. I knew there was something about you, Miller said, his voice trembling slightly. I found this. It's all in here. The ghost, the secret war, everything. Anya stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on the journal in his hand. That journal contained more than just her father's secrets. It contained his pain, his regrets, his love for her. It was the last piece of him she had. Give it back, Miller, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Not until you tell me what's going on, he said, taking a step back. Why are they treating you like some kind of secret weapon? Before Anya could answer, the hangar door creaked open. Sergeant Stone stood there, his face grim. He had been watching them. He had seen Miller take the journal. What's going on here? Stone demanded, his eyes flicking from Miller to Anya. She's a liar, Miller blurted out, holding up the journal. Her father was the ghost. She's been playing us all for fools. Stone's eyes widened in understanding. He looked at Anya, and for the first time, he saw not a timid girl, but the daughter of a legend. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had seen in the eyes of Marcus Thorne all those years ago. Just then, a siren began to wail across the base, a piercing, urgent sound that signaled a real-world threat. It wasn't a drill. The base was on high alert. Colonel Vance's voice boomed over the base-wide intercom, sharp and commanding. Unidentified aircraft have breached our airspace. This is not a drill. All pilots to their stations, scramble the fighters. Now the world seemed to slow down for Anya. The siren, the shouting, the running footsteps outside, it all faded into a dull roar. All she could see was her father's journal in Miller's hand. All she could hear was her father's voice, a whisper from the past. The sky is no place for hate, Anya. It's a place of freedom. Stone looked at Anya, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. They're going to send you up there, aren't they? He asked, his voice low. Anya didn't answer. She looked past him, her gaze fixed on the open hangar door, at the darkening sky beyond. The sky that had been her father's sanctuary, and was now about to become her battlefield. Vance's men burst into the hangar, their weapons drawn. They ignored Miller and Stone, their focus entirely on Anya. Cadet Sharma, one of them said, his voice urgent. Colonel Vance wants you in a cockpit. Now? Anya took a deep breath, the weight of her legacy settling on her shoulders like a physical thing. She looked at Miller, who was still clutching the journal, his face pale with fear and confusion. She looked at Stone, who gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. And then she walked towards the waiting men, towards the waiting jet, towards the waiting sky. She knew that this was the moment she had been preparing for her entire life, the moment when the ghost's daughter would have to fly. But as she was being escorted out, a sudden, powerful explosion rocked the base, sending a shockwave through the hangar. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The siren cut off abruptly, replaced by the terrifying sound of twisting metal and shattering glass. From the direction of the runway, a plume of thick, black smoke began to rise against the twilight sky. It wasn't the unidentified aircraft that had caused the explosion, it was sabotage. Someone on the inside was working with the enemy, and in the ensuing chaos, with alarms blaring and soldiers shouting in the dark, Anya felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her side. She gasped, stumbling forward, her vision swimming. Before she blacked out, she saw a shadowy figure disappearing into the smoky darkness, and a glint of metal on the floor where her father's journal had been. It was gone. The infirmary was a blur of white light and hushed voices. Anya drifted in and out of consciousness. The sharp throbbing pain in her side, a constant reminder of the chaos in the hangar. She remembered the explosion, the darkness, the feeling of a blade sliding between her ribs. She remembered the shadowy figure, the glint of metal, her father's journal. Gone. When she finally woke up, Sergeant Stone was sitting by her bed, his face etched with worry. The base was in lockdown, he told her. The explosion had destroyed 2 F-22s on the runway. The unidentified aircraft had used the confusion to retreat. It was a coordinated attack, and the saboteur was still at large. They were after you, Sharma Stone said, his voice low and gravelly. The explosion was a diversion. They wanted to take you out before you could get in a cockpit. Anya's mind reeled. Who were they, and why did they want her dead? Colonel Vance was convinced it was the work of a rival nation, a desperate attempt to neutralize the asset they had just discovered. He doubled the security around Anya, effectively making her a prisoner in the infirmary. He was more determined than ever to turn her into the weapon he needed, but Anya knew it was more complicated than that. The shadowy figure in the hangar, the stolen journal, it felt personal. Someone knew who she was, who her father was, and they didn't just want her dead. They wanted to erase his legacy. Miller, consumed by guilt and fear, was being held for questioning. He had been found in the hangar, dazed and confused, with a superficial head wound. He told him about the journal, about Anya's father, but Vance dismissed it as the ramblings of a scared kid. He was more interested in the saboteur. Anya knew Miller was innocent. She had seen the real culprit, if only for a second, but she couldn't prove it. She was trapped, her body weak, her mind a whirlwind of unanswered questions. As she recovered, she began to piece together fragments of memory, flashes of her father's life that he had kept hidden from her. She remembered him poring over maps, late at night, his face grim. She remembered hushed phone calls, words like betrayal and cover-up spoken in whispers. She remembered the sadness in his eyes, a deep, abiding sorrow that she had never understood. She realized that her father hadn't just walked away from the war. He had been running from something, or someone. Stone, feeling a sense of responsibility for the girl he had so badly misjudged, became her unlikely ally. He started his own quiet investigation, using his old contacts to dig into the past, to find out what had really happened to Captain Marcus Thorne. He discovered that the Ghost had been part of an elite clandestine unit called Spectre. They were the best of the best, a team of pilots who flew off-the-books missions, the kind that governments denied ever happened. Thorne had been their star, a pilot with an almost supernatural ability to anticipate the enemy's moves. But then, something had gone wrong. On a mission deep in enemy territory, Spectre had been ambushed. The official report said it was a case of bad intelligence. But the survivors, the ones who had made it back, whispered of a traitor in their midst. Someone who had sold them out. Most of Spectre had been wiped out in the ambush. The unit was disbanded, its records sealed, its existence denied. Marcus Thorne, along with a few others, had simply disappeared. The military had buried the story, eager to avoid a scandal. Stone brought his findings to Anya, his face grim. Your father wasn't just a hero, kid, he said. He was a liability. He knew something that people in high places wanted to keep buried. The pieces began to fall into place for Anya. The saboteur on the base, the attack, the stolen journal. It was all connected. Someone was trying to clean up the loose ends of a 20-year-old conspiracy, and she was the last loose end. Her father's journal contained the proof, the names, the dates, the locations. It was a record of the betrayal that had destroyed Spectre, and now, it was in the hands of the enemy. Anya knew she couldn't stay. On the base she was a sitting duck. She had to get out, find the journal, and expose the truth. She had to finish what her father had started. With Stone's help, she began to plan her escape. It was a risky, almost impossible idea, but it was the only way. One night, as a storm raged outside, whipping sand against the infirmary windows, Stone created a diversion. A small controlled fire in a supply closet sent the guards running, their attention focused on the new threat. In the confusion, Anya slipped out of the infirmary, dressed in a stolen maintenance uniform. She was still weak, the wound in her side a dull, throbbing ache. But her resolve was like steel. She made her way to the abandoned hangar, the wind and rain lashing at her. She had to get to the old simulator. It was her only link to her father, her only hope of figuring out what to do next. As she entered the hangar, a flash of lightning illuminated the cavernous space, and she saw that she was not alone. A figure was standing by the old simulator, a silhouette against the flickering light. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it was the saboteur, that she had walked into a trap. But as the figure turned, she saw his face. It was Miller. He looked haggard, his eyes rimmed. He was holding a small metallic object in his hand. "I'm sorry, Sharma," he said, his voice hoarse. "I was a fool. I was so jealous of you, so angry. I didn't understand." He held out the object. It was a small encrypted data chip. "I found this on the floor after the explosion," he said. "It must have fallen out of the journal. I think it's what they were really after." Anya took the chip, her fingers trembling. This was it. The key. But before she could say anything, the hangar door slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. The sound of heavy bolts sliding into place echoed through the hangar. They were trapped. A voice, cold and familiar, crackled over the hangar's old intercom system. "Did you really think it would be that easy, Sharma?" Anya's blood ran cold. "It was Colonel Vance. I must admit, you're more resourceful than I gave you credit for." Vance's voice continued, dripping with condescending amusement. "But this is where it ends. The journal was a nice bonus, but that chip is what I really need. It's the final piece of the puzzle." The lights in the hangar flickered on, revealing Vance standing on a catwalk above them. He was not alone. Flanking him were two figures dressed in black tactical gear, their faces hidden by masks. But Anya recognized their movements, their posture. They were the specialists who had been training her. Her elite instructors were part of the conspiracy. "You," Anya whispered, her voice filled with dawning horror. "You were the traitor. You sold out Spectre." Vance laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Thorne was a fool. He believed in honor, in loyalty. I believe in power. And with that chip, I'll have the power to control the most advanced drone fleet ever created. A fleet that will make pilots like your father obsolete." He gestured to the men beside him. "Bring them to me, and get the chip." The two masked figures began to descend from the catwalk, their movements swift and silent. Anya and Miller were cornered, with nowhere to run. Anya's mind raced. She looked at the old simulator, at the data chip in her hand. There was only one way out. "Miller," she said, her voice low and urgent, "I need you to buy me some time." Miller looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. But then, he saw the look on her face, the same look of fierce determination he had seen in the simulator. He nodded, his jaw set. As Vance's men approached, Miller let out a yell and charged at them, a desperate, suicidal act of defiance. Anya didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the cockpit of the old simulator, her fingers flying over the controls. She slammed the data chip into a port on the console. The screen flickered to life. But instead of the familiar blocky landscape, it was filled with lines of code, schematics, and satellite imagery. It wasn't just a journal. It was her father's black box. His secret weapon. He had anticipated this, had built a backdoor into the military's network. "What are you doing?" Vance yelled from the catwalk, his voice laced with panic, finishing. "What?" my father started, Anya said, her voice cold as ice. She began to type, her fingers a blur. She was not just flying a simulator anymore. She was flying the entire base. She rerouted power, sealed off sections of the base, and activated the fire suppression systems, creating chaos and confusion. She was a ghost in the machine, her father's ghost, and she was about to bring down the house of cards that Vance had built. But as she worked, a warning flashed on the screen. "Intrusion detected. System override in 60 seconds. Vance had a failsafe. He was locking her out. She had 1 minute to download the data, expose the conspiracy, and save herself and Miller. 1 minute before Vance regained control and wiped them both from existence. The countdown began, each second a hammer blow in the silent hangar. Anya's heart pounded against her ribs. She could hear the sounds of Miller's desperate fight, the grunts and thuds of a battle he couldn't win. She had to be faster, but the files were massive, encrypted with layers of security that her father had designed to be nearly unbreakable. As the countdown timer flashed past 30 seconds, a new window popped up on the screen. It was a live video feed from a drone. High above the base, the drone's camera was zooming in, not on the hangar, but on a small, unmarked cargo plane on a remote airstrip, its engines already spinning. Vance was escaping, and in the cargo hold of the plane, visible for just a second as the ramp began to close, was a large, metal crate. A crate that Anya recognized from her father's journal. It wasn't just data on the chip, it was the location of something real, something tangible, something her father had hidden, and that Vance was now stealing. The countdown hit 10 seconds. Anya knew she couldn't download everything in time. She had to make a choice. Expose Vance's treachery to the world, or find out what was in that crate, and stop him from getting away with it. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, torn between two impossible options. The fate of her father's legacy, hanging on a single keystroke. The rhythmic beep of the countdown timer was a death knell. 987. Anya's mind was a whirlwind. Expose Vance now, and he might still escape, his stolen prize disappearing into the shadows forever. Go after the crate, and the truth of what he did to Spectre might be buried with her. Father's voice echoed in her memory, a whisper from the old simulator. Sometimes, Anya, you have to choose the fight that matters most, not the one that's easiest to win. The fight that mattered most. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about what was in that crate. 6, 5. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She wasn't downloading, she was uploading. She sent a single encrypted packet of data, the most damning evidence from the journal. The proof of Vance's treason not to the wider network, but to a single, secure, address, an address she had memorized from her father's notes. The address of the one man her father had trusted. General Abram, the retired but still influential former head of special operations. For 3, then, with the last remaining seconds, she did something else. Something her father had taught her was only to be used in the most desperate of circumstances. She accessed the base's own drone control system, the very system Vance sought to command. She found the drone that was tracking Vance's plane and seized control of it. It was an older model, a Reaper, armed with only surveillance equipment, but it was fast too. 1. The system override kicked in. The screen went black. The simulator died. Anya was locked out. Vance's mocking laughter echoed from the catwalk. Too late, Sharma, you lose. But Anya wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at her wrist, where a small, battered watch, her father's watch, was strapped. The screen on the watch flickered to life, displaying a video feed. The feed from the Reaper drone. She still had a set of eyes in the sky. Below, Miller was down, one of Vance's men standing over him, a pistol aimed at his head. The other was advancing on the simulator, ready to drag Anya out. It's over, Vance said, his voice smug. Now, give me the chip. Suddenly, the hangar was flooded with light. The main doors were being forced open from the outside, the screech of protesting metal filling the air. A squadron of military police, led by a grim-faced Sergeant Stone, stormed into the hangar, their weapons raised. Vance. Stone roared. It's over. The whole base is locked down. General Abram is on his way. Vance's face contorted. With rage, he looked from Stone to Anya, his eyes burning with hatred. He had been outmaneuvered. This isn't over, he snarled. He pulled out his own sidearm and fired. Not at Stone, but at a control panel on the wall. Sparks flew, and a section of the catwalk collapsed, creating a barrier between him and the MPs. In the confusion, he and his 2 men disappeared through a side door, escaping into the storm. Stone rushed to Anya's side as she climbed out of the simulator. Are you all right, kid? He's getting away, Anya said, her voice urgent, pointing to the watch on her wrist. He has something. Something my father hid. Stone looked at the drone feed on her watch, at the cargo plane. Taxiing down the remote runway, he made a split-second decision. I'll handle things here, he said. You go. Do what you have to do. He turned to his men. Get me a line to the tower. I want every fighter on this base scrambled. And someone get a medic for this. Cadet, he yelled, pointing at the injured Miller. But Anya was already moving. She knew there was only one plane on the base that could catch Vance. A plane that was kept off the official roster, hidden in a secure climate-controlled hangar. A plane that Vance himself had been restoring, a trophy from a bygone era. It was an F-1 for Tomcat, the same model her father had flown. She sprinted through the rain-swept base, her side screaming in protest. The guards at the secure hangar recognized her, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. They had heard the rumors, seen the lockdown. They didn't stop her. The Tomcat was a beautiful, terrible beast, a relic of a time when pilots were more important than processors. Anya's hands moved with practiced familiarity over the controls. The cockpit, a second home. She fired up the engines, the roar a symphony of raw power. As she taxied onto the runway, her coms crackled to life. It was Stone. Anya, you can't do this. You're not cleared for flight. You're wounded. Vance has a 20-year head start, Sergeant Anya said, her voice steady. I'm closing the distance. She pushed the throttle forward, and the Tomcat leaped into the stormy sky. A ghost chasing a ghost. The flight was a brutal test of her endurance. The G-forces tore at her, her wound a searing fire in her side. But she pushed through the pain. Her focus absolute. She followed the signal from the Reaper drone, which she controlled from a small panel in the cockpit. A modification her father had designed. Vance's cargo plane was fast, flying low to avoid radar, but the Tomcat was faster. Anya closed the gap, the cargo plane now a dark shape against the churning clouds. Vance's voice, tinny and laced with fury, came over the coms. He had realized he was being followed. You just don't know when to quit, do you, Sharma? You're just like your father, a sentimental fool. It's over, Vance, Anya said, her voice cold. There's nowhere left to run. I have friends, Sharma, friends in high places. You can't touch me. As if on cue, 2 new contacts appeared on her radar, closing in fast. They weren't from Blackwood. They were unmarked, Statovi fighters, faster and more maneuverable than her old Tomcat. They were Vance's friends. They moved to intercept her, boxing her in, their intentions clear. They weren't going to warn her off. They were going to shoot her down. Anya's heart hammered against her ribs. She was alone, outgunned, and a relic from another era. The pain in her side was becoming unbearable, her vision starting to blur at the edges. You see, Sharma? Vance's voice mocked her. You're a ghost. just like your father, and ghosts don't get happy endings. The two enemy fighters opened fire, a stream of cannon fire streaking past her cockpit. Anya threw the Tomcat into a desperate dive, the plane groaning in protest. She was back in the simulator, but this time, the missiles were real, the danger absolute. She was outnumbered, her plane was old, and her body was failing her. She could see the cargo plane pulling away, disappearing, into the storm. Vance was winning. She had to make a choice. Let him go, and save herself. Or risk it all for a crate whose contents she could only guess at. She thought of her father, of the sadness in his eyes. She thought of the promise she had made to him. She would not let his legacy be one of fear and regret. She pulled back on the stick, her knuckles white. She would not run, she would dance. But as she prepared to engage the two fighters, a new voice, calm and steady, crackled over her cums. A voice she hadn't heard in years. A voice she thought she would never hear again. A little turbulence. Stardust, the voice, said, using the nickname her father had given her when she was a little girl. Need a wingman. Anya's head snapped up. A third fighter, a sleek, black F-22 Raptor with no markings, was streaking towards her from out of the clouds. It moved with an impossible grace, a predator in its natural element. It fired a volley of flares, drawing the enemy's missile lock away from Anya's Tomcat. Anya stared, her breath caught in her throat, her heart a wild, frantic bird in her chest. It couldn't be, it was impossible. But she knew that flying style, she knew that voice. The Black Raptor performed a perfect Herbst maneuver, a move that only one other pilot in the world knew how to do. It slid into position beside her, a phantom in the storm. The cockpit of the Raptor was dark, the pilot's face obscured by a helmet and visor. But Anya didn't need to see his face. She knew. Dad, she whispered, her voice trembling, tears blurring her vision. The cargo plane was almost gone, a speck in the distance. The two enemy fighters were regrouping, preparing for another attack, and in the middle of it all, a ghost had returned from the dead. The sky had suddenly become a very crowded, very dangerous place, and Anya was caught right in the center of a storm. She was no longer sure she understood. The voice on the other end of the com was silent for a moment, the only sound, the crackle of static and the roar of two jet engines. Then, keep your eyes on the bogey, Stardust. We'll talk later. It was him, it was her father. The wave of shock and disbelief that washed over Anya was so powerful it almost made her black out. He was alive. All these years he had been alive. The questions swirled in her mind, a chaotic storm that mirrored the one outside her cockpit. Why? How? But there was no time for questions. The two enemy fighters, momentarily confused by the appearance of the Black Raptor, were now pressing. Their attack? They split up, one coming for Anya's Tomcat, the other engaging the Raptor. He's all yours. Her father's voice said, calm and steady, as if they were back in the old crop duster, practicing maneuvers over the cornfields. Anya, training, her instincts, her father's lessons, they all took over. The pain in her side, the confusion in her mind, it all faded away, replaced by a singular, cold focus. She was a pilot. This was her sky. She threw the old Tomcat into a spiraling dive, the enemy fighter on her tail, firing a stream of cannon, fire that stitched a deadly pattern across the clouds behind her. She could feel the pilot's aggression, his overconfidence. He thought she was an easy target. He was wrong. She let him get closer, closer, until he filled her rearview display. Then, just as he was about to get a missile lock, she did something that wasn't in any manual. She deployed her landing gear. The sudden drag on the Tomcat was immense. The plane shuddered violently, threatening to tear itself apart, but it did exactly what Anya wanted it to do. It slowed her down with impossible speed. The enemy fighter, caught completely by surprise, overshot her, just as the virtual fighters had in the simulator. And just like in the simulator, Anya was now on his tail. Guns, 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 she whispered, her thumb pressing the trigger. The Tomcat's cannons roared to life, and a stream of 20mm shells tore into the enemy fighters. Wing, it trailed smoke, spiraling out of control towards the churning sea below. One down. She looked for her father. The Black Raptor was in a deadly dance with the second fighter. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing to watch. Her father was a master, an artist. He didn't just fly the plane, he was part of it. He moved with a fluid, intuitive grace that Anya had only ever dreamed of achieving, but the enemy pilot was good. His state-of-the-art jet, faster and more agile than the Raptor, he tatedly was slowly gaining the upper hand, forcing her father onto the defensive. Dad, he's boxing you in, Anya yelled into her cums. I see him, Stardust, her father replied, his voice still unnervingly calm, just enjoying the view. Anya knew that calm. It was the calm before the storm, the calm he always had right before he did something completely insane. The Raptor suddenly pitched up, climbing vertically, just as Anya had done in the simulator. It was the Ghost's gambit. The enemy pilot, perhaps warned by Vance, didn't fall for it. He didn't overshoot. He climbed with the Raptor, staying on its tail, waiting for it to stall. But Marcus Thorne wasn't planning on stalling. As the two planes rocketed towards the heavens, the Raptor did something new, something Anya had never seen before. It fired its a modification that shouldn't have existed on an F-22. The Raptor stopped dead in the sky, as if it had hit an invisible wall. The enemy fighter, with no time to react, shot past him, and for a split second, it was exposed. Its belly turned towards the Raptor. Marcus Thorne didn't hesitate. A single missile shot from the Raptor, a silver streak against the gray sky. The enemy fighter exploded in a ball of fire. Silence. The black Raptor descended, pulling up alongside Anya's Tomcat. The two planes flew in perfect formation, two ghosts in the storm. Nice shooting. Kid, her father's voice said, a hint of pride in his tone. You too, Anya replied, her voice thick with emotion. Where have you been? It's a long story, Stardust, one we don't have time for right now. His voice turned grim. Vance is heading for a decommissioned oil rig. It's a black site. If he gets there, he and that crate will disappear forever. The oil rig appeared on Anya's radar, a small, isolated platform in the middle of the raging sea. Vance's cargo plane was already descending, preparing to land. We have to stop him, Anya said. We will, her father replied. But we're out of missiles. We'll have to do this the old-fashioned way. The old-fashioned way. Guns? A close-quarters dogfight over a storm-tossed sea, with an enemy who knew they were coming. As they approached the rig, the cargo plane's rear ramp lowered. But it wasn't for unloading cargo. A heavy-duty rotary cannon emerged from the darkness of the hold, a monstrous weapon designed to shred anything that got too close. Well, Marcus said, his voice dry, that's new. The cannon opened fire, a torrent of lead and fire erupting from the back of the cargo plane. The sky around the two fighters was filled with explosions and shrapnel. Break, Marcus yelled. The two planes split, diving in opposite directions, the cannon tracking Anya's Tomcat. She weaved and dodged, the shells tearing through the air around her, some of them striking her wing, the impacts jarring the entire aircraft. Warning lights flashed across her console. Her plane was failing. Anya, get out of there, her father yelled, his voice laced with panic. Your plane can't take much more of this. I can't shake him, Anya replied, her teeth gritted. Against the pain, the cannon was relentless, its targeting system locked onto her. She could see the cargo plane, so close now. She could see Vance, a small figure standing on the ramp, a look of triumph on his face. He was going to win. He was going to watch her die, just as he had watched her father's friends die 20 years ago. Anya's mind raced. There was no escape. The cannon was too accurate, her plane too damaged. But then she remembered something her father had told her, a lesson from long ago. Every weapon has a weakness. Anya, you just have to be smart enough to see it. The cannon, it was mounted on the ramp. It could only fire backwards. Anya made a decision, a desperate, suicidal, crazy decision. It was the only way. Dad, she said, her voice strangely calm. I have an idea. Trust me, Anya. No, he shouted, realizing what she was about to do. She ignored him. She stopped weaving. She stopped dodging. She flew straight. She pushed the throttle of her dying Tomcat to its limit, aiming not at the cargo plane, but directly at the stream of fire erupting from its belly. She was flying into the cannon's mouth. Anya. Her father's voice was a scream of anguish. The world dissolved into a blur of fire and noise. The shells hammered against her cockpit, the armored glass cracking, threatening to shatter. Alarms blared, the plane screaming its death agony. But Anya's eyes were fixed on her target. The cannon dot. She was so close now. She could see the barrels spinning, see the muzzle flashes. She could see Vance's face, his look of triumph turning to one of horrified disbelief. She pressed the trigger. Her own cannons, the last bit of life in her dying plane, roared one last time. A stream of shells, fired from point-blank range, slammed into the rotary cannon's housing. There was a massive explosion. The cannon, its ammunition ignited, blew apart, taking the entire ramp of the cargo plane with it. Vance, who had been standing on the ramp, simply vanished in the fireball. Anya's Tomcat, mortally wounded, began to tumble out of the sky. The controls were dead. The engines were on fire. She was going down. She reached for the eject handle, but her body was a dead weight, the pain in her side an all-consuming fire. Her vision tunneled, the world fading to black. The last thing she heard was her father's voice, raw with desperation, screaming her name. The last thing she saw was the black Raptor diving after her, a dark angel falling from a burning sky. And then, there was only darkness, the roar of the wind, and the cold, unforgiving embrace of the sea. The first thing Anya felt was the cold, a deep, biting cold that seemed to seep into her bones. The second was the gentle, rhythmic rocking. She was on a boat. The sound of a diesel engine and the smell of salt and fish confirmed it. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was low and rusted. She was in the small cabin of a fishing trawler, lying on a narrow bunk. Her flight suit had been cut away, and her side was heavily bandaged. The pain was a dull, distant ache, muted by whatever painkillers she'd been given. The cabin door opened, and a weathered, bearded face peered in. The man looked her over with kind, worried eyes. "Ah, you're awake," he said in a thick Scandinavian accent. "Good, we were worried." Anya tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness and pain forced her back down. "What?" What happened? She rasped, her throat dry. You fell from the sky. Little bird, the fisherman said. My son and I, we saw the whole thing. The big plane, the fire, and then you, coming down in your parachute. We pulled you from the water. You were very lucky. Her parachute, she didn't remember pulling the eject handle. Someone must have. The memory came back in a flash. The black raptor, diving after her, her father. There was another plane, she said, her voice urgent. A black one. And a pilot. Did you see him? The fisherman shook his head. No, just you. The storm was bad. We had to get back to shore. Anya's heart sank. Had he gone down with her? Had she found him only to lose him again? The fisherman gave her some water and a piece of dry bread. He told her they were headed for a small, isolated port on the Canadian coast. They would be there by morning. He had been afraid to use the radio, not knowing who she was or who might be looking for her. Anya spent the next few hours drifting in and out of a restless sleep, her mind a torment of unanswered questions. When the trawler finally docked, the gray morning light filtering through the porthole, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had to find him. The fisherman helped her onto the dock, giving her an old, oversized coat to hide her tattered uniform. Be careful, little bird, he said. The world is not always a kind place. Anya thanked him, her heart filled with gratitude for the simple, kind man who had saved her life. As she walked away from the docks, into the sleepy fishing village, she felt utterly alone. She had no ID, no money, no way of contacting anyone. She was a ghost, just like her father. She found a small cafe and huddled in a corner, nursing a cup of hot water, trying to figure out what to do next. She saw a newspaper on a nearby table. The headline sent a chill down her spine. Military training accident at Blackwood AFB. Rogue pilot killed in crash. The article was short, filled with official-sounding jargon. It said that Cadet Anya Sharma, a disturbed and unstable recruit, had stolen an F-14 Tomcat and gone on a joyride, crashing into the sea. It mentioned a minor security breach at the base, but said nothing of Vance, the conspiracy, or the battle over the ocean. They were covering it up. They were erasing her, turning her into the villain of a story she had never written. Her anger was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. They would not get away with it. She was about to leave when a man in a dark suit entered the cafe. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering on her for a fraction of a second too long. Anya's instincts screamed. She slipped out the back door. Her heart pounding, she ran, her side protesting with every step. She ducked into an alleyway, pressing herself against the cold, damp brick. The man in the suit appeared at the end of the alley, blocking her escape. He wasn't alone. Another man, built like a refrigerator, stood beside him. Anya Sharma, the first man said, his voice polite, but with an underlying menace. We've been sent to take you home. There are people who want to talk to you. Anya knew who had sent them. Vance's friends, the ones in high places. They were here to silence her for good. She was trapped. There was no way out. But then, a black sedan screeched to a halt at the other end of the alley. The driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped out. He was older, with graying hair and a face that was etched with lines of grief and regret. But his eyes, they were the same eyes that had looked at her with such love and pride her whole life. Dad, she whispered. Marcus Thorne looked at the two men in suits, his expression unreadable. I think you gentlemen have the wrong person, he said, his voice calm, but with an edge of steel. The men in suits exchanged a look. They had not expected this. Captain Thorne, the first man said, his politeness slipping. You're supposed to be dead. I got better, Marcus said. He opened his jacket, revealing the butt of a pistol tucked into his waistband. Now, I suggest you leave. Before this gets complicated, the men hesitated, weighing their options. But then, another car, a government-issue black SUV, pulled up behind them. Sergeant Stone got out, followed by two armed MPs. It's over, Stone said, his voice grim. General Abram got your message. Captain, he's cleaning house. Your friends in high places are being rounded up as we speak. The two men in suits, realizing they were cornered, slowly raised their hands. Anya ran to her father, throwing her arms around him, the tears she had held back for so long finally falling. He held her tight, his own eyes wet with emotion. Sorry, Stardust, he whispered. I'm so sorry for everything. Later, in a secure military debriefing room, the full story came out. Marcus Thorne explained that after the Spectre betrayal, he had been forced into hiding, hunted by Vance and his powerful co-conspirators. He had faked his own death to protect Anya, watching over her from the shadows his entire life. He had built a network of loyalists, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. Anya's arrival at Blackwood, and her uncanny skill, had forced his hand. He had ejected her from the falling Tomcat remotely, his final, desperate act to save her. Before his own damaged Raptor went down, he had been picked up by his own people, a small, loyal crew who had been waiting for his signal. The crate, they learned, contained the prototype for a new kind of stealth technology, a project her father had been working on before he disappeared. Vance had planned to sell it to the highest bidder. In the end, the truth came out. General Abram, armed with the evidence from Anya and her father, dismantled the conspiracy, arresting dozens of high-ranking officers and politicians. Vance's body was never recovered from the sea, but his network was destroyed. Anya's name was cleared. She was no longer a rogue pilot, but a hero. She was offered a position as a flight instructor, a chance to teach a new generation of pilots the lessons she had learned from her father. A few weeks later, Anya was back at Blackwood, but this time, things were different. The mockery and suspicion were gone, replaced by respect and awe. Miller, who had been cleared of all charges, was the first to salute her, his face a mixture of shame and admiration. She stood with her father and Sergeant Stone in the abandoned hangar, in front of the old simulator that had started it all. "So, what's next for the ghost and his daughter?" Stone asked, a rare smile on his face. Marcus looked at Anya, his eyes filled with love. "I'm retired, Sergeant. It's her sky now." Anya looked at her father, and then at the simulator. She had spent her whole life chasing his shadow, trying to live up to his legend, but she realized now that she didn't have to. She could be her own person, make her own legend. But as she looked at the dusty old machine, she noticed something she had never seen before. A small brass plaque, hidden on the side of the console. It was tarnished with age, the inscription barely legible. She wiped away the dust. There were 2 names on it. One was Marcus Thorne. The other was a name she didn't recognize. A woman's name, Captain Evelyn Reed. And underneath the names, a single, chilling inscription, Spectre 01 and Spectre 02, the first ghosts. May they fly forever. Anya's blood ran cold. Spectre 02. Her father had never mentioned a partner. Who was Evelyn Reed, and why was her name on this plaque, hidden away in this forgotten hangar? She looked at her father, a thousand new questions swirling in her mind. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of the old sadness in his eyes, a shadow of a story that was still untold. The legend of the ghost, she realized with a jolt, was far from over. It had just begun.